Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Vegas Legal Magazine podcast. I'm Mark Fierro, Fierro Communications, with Vegas Legal Magazine publisher Tyler Morgan. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today, our guests, Milan Chatterjee, president of American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, and Mark Hutchison, our former Nevada Lieutenant Governor and current vice chairperson of AAJLJ in Nevada, to talk about the direction of the organization and its role in these difficult, rapidly changing times. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Great to be here, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time. Milan, tell us about the genesis of the organization, why it was created nationally and its role here in Nevada.
Well, the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists is an organization based out of Washington, D.C. and New York. And the goal of this organization is to advance civil rights and human rights in the Jewish community. While this chapter is very vibrant and active in the East Coast and in Chicago, we've always been looking at building a West Coast presence. I got involved in this organization when I was a law student at NYU Law School in New York. It's a great organization. They cover great topics. They have wonderful people. Now I live in Las Vegas. I've been here personally for 2 years. My family has been here for 12 years. And I see that there's a lot of people in the Las Vegas and Nevada community who are very pro-Israel, who stand up against anti-Semitism, like Lieutenant Governor Hutchison, but there's no organization to really push, that motive, or to advance that motive or sentiment. So I worked with the national organization to create a chapter here in Nevada. And we have a managing board of about 20 top lawyers, judges, and attorneys and politicians. So it's been very exciting to start.
It's interesting in these times that are changing so quickly. The death of John Lewis this week brings up an amazing point. So many of the freedom riders, they could have felt like they were completely alone, but there were white faces on those buses. There were white faces that got beaten up as well, and practically all of them were young Jewish men and women. And they have stood up. They have stood up over the years, and it sounds like you can hear that call again now.
Absolutely. The Jewish community has been very close with the African-American community and other communities in terms of advancing civil rights in this country. Another organization I'm involved with is the American Jewish Committee. They've been very involved in Washington, D.C. and forming those alliances and coalitions. And one thing good about AAJLJ is the national organization regularly puts amicus briefs, whether at the U.S. Supreme Court or other courts, to help push some of these civil rights issues and advance causes for justice. So that's something I'm very proud about.
Can you give us an example of some projects or cases you've been working on for this organization?
So, there's something big, and Mark can talk more about it because he has more personal organizations, called the BDS Movement, Boycott, Divest, Sanction Israel Movement. And this is an out of the mainstream movement that wants the United States to end all diplomatic, academic, and economic relations with the state of Israel. Now, the state of Israel, it's one of our biggest allies. So that's not going to happen. But even though this is an out of mainstream movement, they've built a lot of tractions on college campuses where they're harassing, bullying Israeli and Jewish students, creating a hostile and unsafe campus climate for them. And is becoming worse and worse. And this is starting to get into the mainstream, in some of the state legislatures and the US Congress. You see a lot of anti-Israel politicians who want to boycott, divest, sanction Israel, and especially for a Jewish community, is considered to be very insulting to their religious sentiments. So we've done a lot of work with professors, academicians, lawyers, and educating people. This is what BDS is. This is how it violates civil rights. The Trump administration passed executive orders saying it violates Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And basically, expose what BDS is and to provide the necessary support to combat it.
Mark Hutchison, you've got the background in politics. What happened? Over time, you think about it, when I was a young man, Israel and the United States were joined at the hip forever. We didn't need to even ask each other for favors. It was a matter of the two countries were always going to work together. And slowly, this drumbeat, where did it come from? Where is it headed?
Well, Mark, as Milan had mentioned, a lot of this activity started on college campuses. A lot of groups thought that Israel was engaged in actions and activities and political positions that were contrary to their own political positions. And so they began to do everything they could to delegitimize Israel and to really begin to paint Israel in a very, I think, false and certainly a negative light, but I think also a false light. And they began to do that so that they could then try to change the policies of the United States towards Israel. So I would say that this really started to happen probably in great gusto over the 90s and into the 2000s. And we've seen more and more of this pick up across the country, where these very strident political views are expressed on campus, where there are very strong efforts to get the Congress to defund Israel, to punish any companies that may help and be supportive of Israel. And so it really began with a movement in academia, really, and on college campuses. And the response to that, Mark, has then been Friends of Israel have stepped forward, both at the congressional level and also at the state and local level, to respond to that and to push back hard against that. And that's what a lot of these laws that are called anti-BDS laws seek to do. And that is to push back against what we consider to be a very imprudent and improper characterization of Israel.
Unthinkable. Wouldn't it have been unthinkable? 15, 20, just the furthest thing from your mind of all possibilities. It's like all of a sudden going to war with the Irish. To what end? Why?
Yeah.
Where does it start?
Yeah, and I don't know that I've got a good answer for that, Milan. Maybe you do. I know that that there are just those who believe that that Israel, contrary to all of my experience, contrary to what I believe are the facts and the truth, are somehow violating civil rights or human rights, and therefore have got to be called to task on this. When in fact, at least what I've seen when I visited Israel on 3 different occasions and met with various government officials there, as well as business leaders, to be just the opposite. That they are doing all that they can to be inclusive and provide as many opportunities for people of all walks of life, Palestinians, as well as those of the Jewish faith and Israeli citizens, to participate fully in society and to the benefits of Israel. So I see it as a really an unfortunate movement that I'm not really sure, Mark, what the answer is in terms of where this all started, where the sentiment came from, other than there are those who see Israel in a much, much different light than what really is true and factual.
You know, and my concern, the greatest concern, is seeing what we see in Europe now. This outright, overt, violent, armed stabbings, shootings, that are just pure anti-Semitism. It's not even, it doesn't even have a political aim. It's just pure anti-Semitism. Is there the possibility that that sort of thing catches fire the way some of these other movements have here in the United States?
Well, fortunately, I'll start with Nevada. Fortunately, in Nevada, we don't have a lot of evidence of that in Nevada right now. And I think a lot of that has to do with the strong position that the legislature has taken, that our leaders have taken in supporting Israel and just in supporting human rights and civil rights in general. But we have, Mark, seen that throughout the country. We've seen that, in the Northeast, in New York, and throughout New Jersey. There have been examples of what you're talking about in the United States, and that the frequency has increased.
Mm.
I'm not linking the two in any way, shape, or form, but I was the one time that I was taken aback, the one time that I was surprised was when Benjamin Netanyahu, there was a friction that existed with prior President Obama, and it seemed to be something of an off-ramp for us. I can't imagine any time in the history of Israel, and I've watched fairly closely, that there was any type of friction between two men from the two countries. And from my perspective, I think it was a mistake. I think both men should have cast it aside. There are more important things on the table here. This is a relationship, God willing, that'll outlast both men's lives and everybody else's as well. I was troubled then, and it sounds as if, to me, looking at this, it had to have started somewhere. It was almost as if a door got cracked open in that regard.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you're right, Mark, in terms of previously we had this relationship with Israel that was just unassailable. And it reminds me a lot of the relationship the United States has with the UK, and just our long historical relationship where we may disagree with each other on various policies from time to time, but we had each other's back. There was not going to be 1 inch of daylight between us. And that's been true of Israel and UK and some other countries, but those two in particular. And part of the reason is we had such a strategic advantage being partners with each other and being close to each other. You know, Israel is in a neighborhood that, as you well know, is one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the world, and they are our most loyal and faithful ally in that region that we absolutely have to have to promote the interests of the United States of America there. And that's why I'm saddened by this cracking of the relationship. And I sense that's happening more and more, and within the Congress of the United States, when that was an unassailable relationship previously, as you've mentioned several times.
And let me ask you, how did this all change? Because I know in the last year or so, didn't we just move the embassy into Jerusalem?
Yes. Yep,
and how did that affect? What was the impact overall on the relationship with Israel at that point?
Well, that was that was something that Israel has been asking for I can't remember how many election cycles going back, but it's been, probably since, Reagan, H.W. Bush, going back that far, where there has been formal requests by the Israelis that Jerusalem be recognized as the true capital of Israel. That is a very hot button for the Palestinians. Because they have claim to the city of Jerusalem as well, and there have been other countries, as you well know, who have controlled Jerusalem before Israel did. And so when the United States came in and put our weight behind Israel and said we are going to recognize Jerusalem as the true capital of Israel, that was a major step in showing the extent to which the United States supported Israel today. We've always supported Israel. We've been friends with them. We've been strong allies. But when we came forward and the Trump administration approved moving the Jerusalem, the capital to the embassy to Jerusalem, and recognized Jerusalem as the true capital of Israel, that was a major step in our relationship, and I think really solidified the relationship even more.
I just to play devil's advocate for a moment, one of the strengths that the United States has always had with the Palestinians is that we could always claim to be arbiters, that we would stand in the middle and respect both sides. So there was a downside to that, and I guess part of what we're seeing may come as a result of that. I think the one thing that always bound us together is the sense of, indeed, in word, that progressive social justice tradition that Israel always had. Now, I'm not talking about the kind of liberal, but just the idea that everybody counted, counted, and that Israel was going to try and find peace. If you're not bombing their buses, bombing civilians, if you don't make a claim that your goal in life is to wipe them off of the map, I think is what came from Iran. That one notch, again, just a little bit of a belt tightening, but I hope that there is a way that we get back to those days, that fluid relationship between the two, because the truth is we do have an enemy that hopefully will be backed off and turned back into a potential enemy, and that's Iran. And that's their insistence on a day-to-day basis to export death into every corner that they can where they think that they can get away with it and that no one will notice. They paid a price in recent days. I don't think it was the Israelis. I don't think it was the United States. If I had to bet $10,000, I'd say it was both of them working together, like in the good old days. But Iran if Iran is to become, I believe, the great nation that it always has had the potential, and they were among our best friends. We shouldn't forget.
Right.
Some of the best educated
Right.
people and fundamental beliefs in human rights, and somehow that all got washed away. And I don't know what the end of that is. So turning a page, let's come back locally. So what can you do? I know the power of amicus briefs can be incredible. Coming from a third party that says, this isn't right, and let me show you, we don't have a dog in this fight except for justice. Talk about what happens locally, the work of the organization locally.
Absolutely. So we have 4 tenets. One is we want to have academic events, panels, discussions, which has been the crux of this organization on the various incidents in the Jewish community, various incidents of anti-Semitism, the various public policy issues, the various constitutional law and legal issues. And we have amongst America's brightest, professors, lawyers, political leaders who can help lead these discussions. That's part number 1. Part number 2 is we want to unite the legal community in Nevada. Because we are a new organization, we believe that it's important for us to start by getting all of the attorneys, judges together and united around the mission. So we hope to have several events where we do that. Third is the amicus briefs, and not just through amicus briefs, through various press releases, various briefings, various reaching out to our political leaders to educate them on what's going on, what's right, what's wrong. That's something we want to do. We also want to educate the Jewish and Israeli American communities on what's going on politically. While we are a nonpartisan organization, we do plan to have Meet the Candidates event so that, the politicians, political leaders running for office, judges, they can voice their platforms to the Jewish community, and the Jewish community can also voice, their opinions, their needs about the various issues affecting them. So this is where we hope to start and ultimately grow from there.
Milan, you have a pretty extensive and impressive board that's part of this organization. Why don't you give us a little background about who's involved?
So we have 20 leaders in the managing board. They all are top lawyers, judges, politicians. So Justice Alyssa Kadish, she's going to be chairing. Lieutenant Governor Hutchison, he's vice chairing. We have the sitting Chief Justice Christina Pickering. She's on our board. We have a number of district court judges. Judge Doug Herndon, he's on. Judge Kirshner, Joanna Kirshner, she's on. Judge Ron Israel. We have some top lawyers here. We have David Chesnov. He's a big celebrity lawyer here, good friend of mine. He's Jewish. He's very pro-Israel. We're honored to have him. Patty Glazer, she's been a mentor of mine. While she's based in LA, she's represented a lot of clients here in Las Vegas. She used to have an office here, and she's like an honorary member of the Las Vegas community, so we have her involved. So several district court judges, Supreme Court justices, top lawyers, and Lisa Krasner, she's a state assemblywoman. She presented a bill to create a Holocaust museum in Nevada. Unfortunately, that didn't pass through committee, but we believe that she's very pro-Israel and will continue to do great things in the state assembly.
And you have a background with a history with Sands Group, with the Adelsons. Are they involved, or do they keep any involvement with you guys?
They don't. I am a corporate attorney for Las Vegas Sands. I work in the compliance department. Based on company policy, I cannot discuss my job or involvement in the organization, but the Adelsons are not involved. I have met Mr. Adelson socially outside of my job. At the Israeli American Council, they have a big presence in Las Vegas. There's also FIDF, Friends of the Israeli Defense Forces. They have an annual dinner here. So I've met him twice, but they're not involved with this endeavor.
Is there a divestment movement in Nevada that we have to watch out for?
So, Mr. Hutchinson, I think he rightly said it wasn't an issue here because there's a vibrant state legislature. We had the lieutenant governor's leadership in passing legislation to make sure that doesn't happen. Unfortunately, that's changing. UNLV is slowly becoming a hotbed. You're having a lot of divestment protests, students getting harassed. They're showing movies of anti-Israel movies about how they have human rights violations. They're horrible. I just saw on the internet a week or two ago, there was an event called Day of Rage. And these were basically anti-Israel activists who were driving through the Las Vegas Strip with Palestinian flags and ostracizing the state of Israel. So while we have a good BDS law, unfortunately on the UNLV campus, this seems to be a growing issue. And organizations like us have a special responsibility to highlight it and to take action to prevent it.
Okay, so let's talk about highlighting it. How do you put, because I agree with you. I think if you turn the bright light on and bring truth to the matter, I think that a lot of these things will fall apart before they get started. So what is the first step? What is it that the community does before we find ourselves enmeshed in this and trying to explain our way out of a deeper hole?
So first off, kind of like what I just said, we need to identify, what are the specific incidents, right? Like, for example, there was this Day of Rage parade. There are these anti-Israel movies. There are students getting harassed on campus. So we need to identify specific incidents. Then we need to explain it to the public that this is what's going on, this is wrong, and this is why it's wrong. Then we need, strong leaders like Lieutenant Governor Hutchison who have strong principles to explain, because they have a lot of credibility on this issue. So they can bring their credibility to explain, what is going on and why it's wrong. And then we also need to work with the stakeholders. For example, if it's a UNLV campus, we need to work with the UNLV administration and giving them some sensitivity guidance that this is very insensitive, this is what's going on, and we need you to take action. And hopefully we can solve it at the local level. If we can't, then we have a state legislature where these types of issues can be solved.
So Mark, what are they motivated? What are these people motivated by? What is it? Is it purely political? Is it just pure anti-Semitism? Where does that come from?
Yeah, I think it's probably at both levels, Mark. There's definitely a political component to this to delegitimize Israel and to then justify increasing that distance that you talked about previously between the United States and Israel. There are just some people who believe that Israel and the United States should not have a close relationship because Israel is engaged in wrongful activity towards the Palestinians. And, I think it just has to be underscored that, the Palestinian people are wonderful. I've met many of them. The organizations that are causing many of the problems, Hamas and Hezbollah, are completely different, though. Those are terrorist organizations that are beginning to get a foothold, not only throughout the United States, but in different hotbed areas. And I don't know what's leading to a lot of this increased anti-Semitism, both in the United States and abroad, beyond what I've already discussed. But I can tell you this, that these radical organizations are looking for recruits, and college campuses provide a very fertile ground for that. And I'm troubled by what's happening on the UNLV campus. And if we don't take some action very quickly, that kind of hate is going to continue to be expressed, and we're going to find ourselves in a place that we are not now currently as a potential hotbed for this anti-Semitism.
I'm just shocked with all the divisiveness going on right now that there's not a lot more public coverage for this. We're not seeing more of this on media channels around the country.
Yeah, I would love to see more coverage on this. It probably gets into a deeper discussion about those who are in the media and whether they are sympathetic to Israel or they're sympathetic to the causes of anti-Israel. And oftentimes it's the latter. And you don't get as much coverage as you do or as you would expect, because it really is an outrageous environment within which anti-Semitism is allowed to flourish. And that's what we have right now. And we've got to put a stop to it. And one of the great ways that we did it in the state was when we passed anti-BDS legislation back during the 2017 session, we made a very clear policy pronouncement as a state that we stand with Israel, and we will not allow this kind of activity to go on in the state of Nevada or in our local governments.
You know, one thing that has happened is it seems to me that these opponents, these particular opponents, so you're talking about UNLV campus in Southern Nevada, there is an air of legitimacy because they're not simply screaming, and they're not simply anti-Semites. They've cloaked it in this political discussion, and whatever's at the bottom of it, the effect is the same. And so I do have a concern because it is focused at, correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, it's focused at very young people. It starts with very young people, and they either talk to the least educated or people who are trying to educate themselves. And it seems as if those are the targets here in America.
Correct. So, Mark, I'll give you a little background on what's going on the college campuses. So, these pro-BDS students, anti-Israel students, they're cloaking it as a social justice issue, even though it isn't. They're saying that the poor Palestinians, they're being mistreated, they're being treated in an apartheid state, kind of like what South Africa was with the differences. So the Palestinians are subjected to the same apartheid state. And this is a social injustice that needs to be cleaned or fixed through the BDS movement, which is absolute baloney. As the lieutenant governor said, Israel has a very vibrant democracy. They're members, Arab members of the Israeli parliament. It's very diverse, very secular in the parliament. So for them to say that the Arabs are treated as second-class citizens or there's an apartheid state is wrong. However, what they're doing is with the social justice message, they're going to other ethnic groups. They're going to Latino students. They're going to African-American students. They're going to various social justice groups, other minority groups. And basically they're saying it's like you're facing social justice issues. We are too. So join our BDS movement. And what you're finding out is that students from other minority groups, they're getting misled that this is a social justice issue and are forming a coalition with BDS. I'll give you an example. The state of California is a big hotbed for BDS, the UC system. I know about it because I went to UCLA. I was the graduate student body president. So recently there was a Black Lives Matter petition at the UC system, which was a good motive. Black lives do matter, and we should not support police brutality. But what they did was they cloaked BDS into it. They said that the same tactics that killed George Floyd, that was imported from Israel, and the Minneapolis police were trained by Israeli police to use these types of tactics to kill George Floyd, which is absolutely incorrect. But they basically cloaked the anti-Israel BDS rhetoric with Black Lives Matter. So that's something that's going on. It's being miscloaked as a social justice issue, and is starting to get traction because of that.
That's just amazing how misinformation gets around. Have you tried getting the message out by utilizing other organizations who maybe on the face don't seem like they have an inherent interest in Israel, but to sort of as a help, so it seems like you can have almost like an objective party assist in getting your message out to maybe get through the minds of the people that are, being run over by the misinformation?
I think that's a very good point you just made. Not just our organization, but there are a lot of other pro-Israel Jewish organizations that are publicly against BDS and this type of anti-Semitism. While there are organizations that have gotten involved, like the AAJLJ, they're a legal organization based in DC. Several non-Israel organizations, they do have a vested interest. So we do need to get the more neutral people involved. One way is to do this is through political parties. The political parties, whether Democrat or Republican, they should take a strong stance against BDS. It should be part of their platform. And these political parties need to make it more mainstream that this type of BDS activity is going on and action needs to be taken. And then there should be other, as you said, more non-vested parties who should come out and take stance against BDS.
Gentlemen, we've run out of time. With that, we call it a day. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Mark, thank you.
Thank you.
The Vegas Legal Magazine podcast. Thank both Milan Chatterjee, president of the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, and Mark Hutchison, vice chairman of AAJLJ in Nevada, for joining us. You can share this podcast on Facebook, tell your friends about it, iTunes, Stitcher, Vegas Legal Magazine's YouTube station. And if you have a story idea, an axe to grind, you can get a hold of Tyler Morgan, publisher of Vegas Legal Magazine, at
702-222-3476.
Thanks for joining us. Be safe out there. Wear your masks. I'm Mark Fierro.